Two new studies published on Tuesday claim to provide more evidence that the COVID-19 virus originated in a wet market in Wuhan, China, and not from a lab leak in the same city. We have the team Rising Fridays to join us for the discussion. Ryan Grim and Emily Jashinsky, welcome to you both. And I think this is the first time all four of us are on camera at once, which is kind of exciting.
When our powers combine.
It's a party.
Yeah, it is a party. So, Ryan, I'll start with you. And we've talked about this when you've co-hosted with me on the show. This information is all, fascinating, and I think absolutely confirms that the wet market was the earliest super spreader event. But what I'm not seeing, contrary to the kind of headlines about these studies, is really definitive evidence that this is where the virus itself originates from.
To find that kind of evidence, you would want to have some type of animal host that you could identify as having, tested positive, or even some, fecal sample or some other, sample of their remains, to show that, like, okay, here is the animal. We think it jumped from this bat. Here's this bat, and this bat was in the wet market. And that is the type of evidence that they've gotten in the past in order to say, like, here is how we know that this zoonotically jumped, from nature, from the wild into humans. That doesn't have this. What this shows is that, right, this Wuhan market was at least the first super spreader event that we know about. Now, we also know that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was less than 10 miles away from there, and people forget this. The CDC, or the Chinese CDC, has a Wuhan branch which was studying all of this stuff as well, and it was less than 500 yards away from this Wuhan market. The WHO investigator, when he came to Wuhan, toured this lab, didn't like the safety protocols that he saw there, could look out the window and see the market from there, and he publicly said, like, this is really concerning. Like, this right here could be your problem, that you had somebody who was infected here, as they were maybe they were doing research from what came from the WIV or their own type of research, and they went to the market. And then the market has just the worst types of conditions for spreading this type of virus that we now know about. At very, very little circulation, and people packed very much together. So if somebody went in there with COVID, you would expect that tons of people would come out of there with COVID.
So, Emily, help us understand what exactly is new here. What is the new evidence that helps us, confirm that, if not the origin of the COVID-19 outbreak, that this was the earliest super spreader event at the wet market?
Right. So there's an Associated Press story that was up on the screen just a second ago, breaking down the findings of two new studies. One is on the cluster, basically the spread of the virus early in Wuhan, and the other is on early samples that we have from Wuhan. And what's really interesting in this AP story is that you have one of the researchers referring to this as, quote, a smoking gun, saying this is as close to a smoking gun for the wet market theory as you could possibly get. Another saying this is very compelling evidence. One of the biggest problems, in addition to what Ryan just said, is, first of all, the media's confidence in doing something that would, in some ways, get China off the hook a little bit for its role, at least when it comes to the lab. The media's confidence in saying, this is it, this looks really compelling, this pretty much puts the lab leak theory to bed, which is I think the tone of this article. But secondly, both of these surveys, and I haven't read them in detail yet, but they do rely on Chinese data. They rely on early data that was provided by the Chinese government. So that's, I think, another kind of conflict of interest in terms of getting to the actual truth here. They're relying on spreading and cluster data from the Chinese government, and they're relying on sample data from the Chinese government. And again, the Chinese government has an interest in covering up the problems that may have existed at the lab, which increasingly, and thanks to a lot of good reporting at The Intercept, actually, we know more about. But they have an interest in, making that kind of go away, or covering that up, or continuing to muddy the waters. So I am not nearly as convinced as the Associated Press article implies that their journalist is, that this is some sort of, we could just put the lab leak theory to bed now.
Right, and that's what's so frustrating, especially when you see people in the media, in the mainstream media, using the term smoking gun. The smoking gun would be finding the animal, as was found in previous outbreaks that then confirmed the animal found more quickly. Now, this time, more resources than ever have been put toward finding the animal, and it's not happened. That would be the smoking gun, and that's not what we got. So, Ryan, what does it say about kind of the mainstream media's, I guess, lack of not total lack of curiosity, but a kind of like, well, yeah, we've nothing more to see here. We've kind of figured this out. Let's move on.
I mean, I think it shows that the intellectual cloudiness that was created by the kind of Trump era remains. Like the smoke hasn't cleared yet. Like in the very beginning, when Trump was saying, what was he calling it? Kung flu, and he was, one of the guys saying, one of the leading figures saying that it came out of this lab. Then reflexively, everybody is going to say, or all the Democrats are going to say, well, that must be wrong. You don't have Trump anymore, but the stench of that is still with it. And Trump's accusation toward the Wuhan lab was kind of shot through with xenophobic, postures and rhetoric. And so at the same time, people were saying, we don't want to feed into that. But I think it's easy for people to step back and say, look, you don't have to blame the Chinese government for this. This was a joint effort, like quite literally a joint effort. Like there was an American organization, EcoHealth Alliance, that was funneling American money from the NIH to this lab. So, if you want to do that meme of, the Chinese Communist Party and USA holding hands and doing this research, they did it together. So it is not throwing China under the bus.
Or pointing at each other like Spider-Man.
I
thought you were doing
the Spider-Man.
Yeah, and Emily, that speaks to the enormous malincentives on the U.S. Health officials' side. We interviewed Fauci on this program earlier this week. And I asked him about the lab leak theory, and he said now he's adopted this posture that, well, I'm not ruling anything out, so that's fine. But then wants to fight over the definition of gain of function at every turn. Wants, to my view, to kind of ignore, very legitimate, not ignore, but kind of sidestep by saying, well, that's not exactly quibbling over the definition. We're not really doing that because it's something a little different from what people are saying. Well, whatever it is, we are very concerned about the U.S. government funding research that manipulates viruses in lab conditions where accidents can happen and there's poor safety records, and it's out of our control. How can we trust our health officials to be honest and transparent about that?
He's ridiculous. I mean, there are early emails in the pandemic of him between him and Francis Collins, basically trying to put this theory away because there's culpability involved in it. And I was reading an old article from early in the pandemic on CNN. It was about something Tucker Carlson had said, and the article just flat out refers to. It says, it should be noted that Tucker Carlson also was saying something about the racist conspiracy theory that the virus leaked from a lab. And it's just crazy when you look back. It's to Ryan's point, whether or not you think that Donald Trump or Tucker Carlson or people, conservatives in general, have problems with, they're flirting with, bigotry or whatever. Whether or not you think that, I obviously disagree, but whether or not you think that, it is not your job as a journalist to protect powerful people who have their own interests at stake just because you don't like the other guys. And that's basically what we've seen happen for the last 2 years, protecting, there's a reporter on a PBS special who covers China for the New York Times, who in this documentary, it's a Frontline documentary, she comes out and says, yeah, I was a little too trusting of China in the beginning. And, I didn't think that they would lie to us this strongly or that they would be this misleading. And of course they are. And so, I just, instead of learning, it's the opposite, right? Like people are just not absorbing any of the really important lessons that we all had to learn the hard way during the pandemic, which is that you have to ask questions of people in power, whether or not you like the guys on the other side, whether or not you like the people in power.
Yeah, I think the issue here is that you just can't rely on your priors here in predictable ways. When I spoke to Jeffrey Sachs about this recently, who is chairing Lancet Medical Journal's COVID-19 origin research investigation, he was pointing out that several of the scientists across national borders had a really trusting understanding of each other just because they were within the scientific community and almost didn't see themselves as political actors in the same way that people from other kinds of communities, explicitly political community or some other type of arena would see themselves as. They saw themselves as mutual scientists. They saw themselves as working together. And I think your point you made just a little bit ago, Emily, about the fact that there's shared culpability here, really obscured some of the finger pointing that was happening earlier on, and how it isn't about whether or not you want to blame China or not when you have so much U.S. money involved. And I remember some of those early actors who were being cited for how lab link theory could absolutely not be the cause of the pandemic were in fact tied to those U.S. money sources going to Wuhan, and those conflicts of interest weren't disclosed. So I think the liability point is so crucial here. If at any time it is proven that lab link theory was at issue here, given how much has been observed about the conditions at the lab being unsafe, and given the billions and billions and untold numbers of money and death that has accrued because of this, it's a disaster, and nobody wants to be holding that ball. And I think the reality is that there's a lot of shared responsibility, which is why early in the pandemic we saw so much in the way of liability waivers coming down over the New York healthcare stuff and the nursing home stuff. Liability waivers everywhere because everyone knows that no one wants to be left holding this ball. Ryan, do you think that there is going to be any effort to hold any folks accountable, even if there were? Do you think it's almost moot because everybody's judgment proof because of the extreme costs that have incurred over this virus? Do you think people have basically decided to give up any chance of tracking down a lab leak theory, because what are you going to do if you do find somebody accountable?
I mean, sad as it is to say, if and when Republicans take control of Congress, I think you'll start to see investigations with subpoena power going after this question, and that's one reason that I would hope that Democrats would get into the mix now, start looking into this now, so it doesn't just become partisan. Because one of the questions that I get asked a lot that really used to confuse me, but I just accept it now as a question that I'll get asked is, who cares? Why? The horse is out of the barn, people are dying, the pandemic's happening. Well, there are a lot more horses in these barns, and some of these, and this could be a small horse compared to the ones that are still in this barn. COVID came out with a 0.5% fatality rate, which is devastating as it is. It's probably trickled down significantly since then as it's evolved into a milder version. But there are pathogens that this lab and these other labs are studying and are working on that have 10-15% fatality rates. You get a virus circulating among the public that's killing 1 out of 10 people. That's just a disaster of biblical proportions. And for the scientific community to say that, it might have been a lab, as Fauci is now saying, it might have been a lab leak, but we don't know, and to kind of stop the conversation there and to say, okay, wait a minute. So it's actually possible, we don't know for sure, but it's actually possible this pandemic might have come from a lab. That means we need to radically rethink what we're doing in these labs, the safety precautions we're taking, and where, and who and where we're setting them up. They probably shouldn't be 500 yards away from a gigantic seafood market. If you want to do this, do it on some deserted volcanic island, where you have to stay for a month after you've gone into the lab, or whatever. If you're going to continue doing this research, instead they'll say, it might have come from the lab, we don't know, and then just move on and continue to do more and more dangerous research at more and more labs around the world. And we just desperately do not want 10 years from now to be looking back at COVID as the mild pandemic, as the one that we long for. We don't want nostalgia for this time.
There's no attitude I understand less than the, what does it matter now approach to this question, because it absolutely matters. Just as a issue of genuine curiosity of trying to understand the trajectory of history, you want this question answered, even if it didn't have policy implications, but it certainly absolutely has policy implications. So Ryan and Emily, it was a pleasure to have all four of our faces on screen at one time, and happy to hand the baton off to you guys tomorrow, right? Today's Thursday,
yes.
Right? Yes, tomorrow. So we'll catch you on Rising Fridays. Thanks for being with us.
See you guys.
Later.
And we will have more Rising right after this.